Our speaker tonight, Edward Larson, as you can see on the front page there, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's also familiar with Massachusetts, even though he's teaching at Pepperdine. He went to Williams College, he went to Harvard, so this is not his first go around with Massachusetts. And he and I have been talking with each other. He was very insistent. He really wants to come to the Cape, and I said that he's got a standing offer to come and have lobster and actually talk in person on the Cape. Although he does, if you've ever been to Malibu, where he teaches at Pepperdine, I've been to the campus at Pepperdine. Their nickname is the Waves, and it's well earned. So I was offering to trade places with him, and he could come to Falmouth, and I'll go to Pepperdine and watch this for him. But he said no, he'll stay there for the. But in the meantime, until he can come to Falmouth, would you welcome our speaker tonight, Edward Larson?
Well, thank you so much. You can hear me okay? Well, Safer at Home doesn't really apply much to the two people I'm talking about, Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. They went in very dangerous places often and put themselves put their lives at risk. Washington had bullets shot through his coat, and Ben Franklin went across, not only served in the military, but went across the Atlantic eight times, including when he was almost 80, which was quite an ordeal back then when they had storms like you just went through, out to sea in a little boat. But I'm talking about them together tonight, and thank you for having me very much. My dear friend, these were the last words that Benjamin Franklin addressed to George Washington. They came at the end of a letter in what Franklin knew would be the last year of his life. Washington closed his response to Franklin with the salutation, "Your sincere friend." In this exchange, written in the first year of Washington's presidency, each expressed his, and I'm quoting here, "undying respect and affection for the other, with Franklin adding esteem and Washington topping him with veneration." At the time, Franklin and Washington were the two most admired individuals in the United States. One of them, of course, born and raised in Massachusetts. Their final letters to each other represented a fitting end to a 3-decade-long partnership that, more than any other pairing, would forge the American nation. Their relationship actually began much earlier, began during the French and Indian War, when Franklin supplied the wagons for British General Edward Braddock's ill-fated assault on Fort Duquesne, and Washington buried the general's body under the dirt road traveled by those retreating wagons. Both had warned Braddock against a frontier attack. "Those Indians will slice you to pieces," they said. And Braddock had replied, "Well, maybe your colonial forces, but not our British redcoats." Well, Franklin and Washington were right. Braddock was wrong. Rekindled in 1775 during the Second Continental Congress, this friendship continued through the Revolution, the Constitutional Convention, and establishment of the new federal government. Perhaps because of the differences in their background, their age, their manner, and their public image, their relationship was not widely commented upon then and remains little discussed today, but it existed and helped shape the course of American history. Now, we usually, when we think about partnerships and when historians write about partnerships in dual biographies, they usually think of partnerships in hierarchical terms. It makes the story easier to tell, such as George Washington and Alexander Hamilton under him, or Thomas Jefferson and James Madison under him. This was a different sort of partnership. This was a partnership of equals. But those also exist. I guess some examples would be Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill. Together they worked, and both were equally necessary to winning the Second World War. It was a partnership, but hardly a hierarchical one. More recent in America, I would say Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson together worked as partners, equal partners, in securing the Civil Rights Act. For Franklin and Washington, the story began with their work as officers in charge of the militia of their respective colonies during the French and Indian War. Now, both learned, and this is how it looked at the beginning of the French and Indian War. The French were in the green, the Brits were in the yellow, and that sort of light green area in the middle was the disputed territory, with Fort Duquesne right there in the middle of it, where Pittsburgh is now. What lessons did they learn? Well, you can see it in their writings. First, they learned that the British had different objectives in their American colonies. The British wanted to keep the colonies divided and dependent, Franklin concluded, and would readily tax them without representation. Washington found the British unwilling to secure the frontier, except as it served their larger geopolitical interests. They weren't interested in us. Second, American colonists would always remain subordinate to their British counterparts, both Washington and Franklin concluded. Washington's bitter frustration with rank confirmed this. He pleaded for a royal commission without receiving one, and was compelled, even though he was a colonel, the highest ranking officer in the Virginia militia, he was compelled to submit to inferior British officers. As for Franklin, when Pennsylvania's proprietors, who still ran the colony within the broad perimeters set by Parliament, heard of his appointment at the Assembly's agent in London, also as Massachusetts' agent, by the way, they dismissed his influence in England. Mr. Franklin's popularity is nothing here, Thomas Penn coolly noted. He will be looked very coolly upon by the great people. Third, the American colonies, they concluded, would benefit from greater unity, as reflected in Franklin's Albany Plan and in Washington's call for greater joint intercolonial military action. After all, it was a force composed mainly of troops from 5 colonies, rather than that Braddock's expedition that finally drove the French from Fort Duquesne. This experience made Washington, as much as Franklin, a believer in union. That'll come back. These 3 lessons might suggest benefits from American independence, but were insufficient to support it as a realistic option. A final shared lessons carried more weight. Despite the war's ultimate outcome, the British were beatable in New World combat. Both of them realized this from the so-called Battle of Monongahela, the battle in which Braddock was killed and wiped out. His troops were out. As Franklin wrote of Braddock's rout, this whole transaction gave us Americans the first suspicion that our exalted ideas of the prowess of the British regulars was really not very well founded. Washington had been there to see it and to report that, at least in frontier fighting, Virginia soldiers outperformed British troops. If put to the test, they might do so again, as they'd find out after the Battle of Lexington and Concord there in Massachusetts. Coupled with the disastrous effects of British colonial policy following the French and Indian War, these shared lessons helped to nurture the revolutionary spirit that brought Franklin and Washington back together a quarter century later to fight and forge a new American Union. Now, at war's end, as I've already suggested, Franklin had gone to London as the agent for Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Georgia. And Washington inherited Mount Vernon, his plantation, when his older brother died. But a new war brought them back together in 1775. That's a story we all know well. And this is the picture of Franklin coming back to join in the Second Continental Congress. Now, this relationship between Franklin and Washington, this renewed relationship, has 3 phases. They were together in Philadelphia during the Second Continental Congress. they had wartime meetings after Washington, at Franklin's urging, was promoted as commander-in-chief, and Franklin became head of the war committee, and including meetings in Massachusetts. And then while they were apart, when Franklin was the ambassador to France, working very closely with Washington, who was commander of the troops, who was critically supported by Franklin, because obviously if the French hadn't been backing us during the war, we wouldn't have won. And so Franklin and Washington had to work very closely together to coordinate French troop movements. Now, Franklin's experience led him to foresee sooner than most the need for undertaking two fundamental reforms during the Revolutionary War. First, he consistently spoke in terms of America rather than the colonies, believing that the British could only be defeated and liberty secured by a united effort, as shown in his famous cartoon for his newspaper, the first political cartoon ever drawn in America. And by the way, if you look closely, those words around it are written by George Washington. Now, having pushed the Albany Plan for Union during the French and Indian War, Franklin introduced a similar, though somewhat stronger, draft constitution for the colonies in July of 1775. Clearly federal in nature, with each colony retaining control over matters peculiar to it, Franklin's draft held concepts that he later pushed at the Constitutional Convention, including proportional representation in Congress, rather than each state getting equal votes, and centralized federal government power over interstate and international commerce, war and peace, foreign affairs, Western lands, and such domestic matters as thought to be necessary for the general welfare of all the people. That's his phrase. These would become the same issues that Washington also embraced at the Revolution's end in his circular letter to the states just before he retired as commander-in-chief, and would later bring to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Second, while many patriots, blinded by faith in their cause, believed that citizen soldiers could quickly vanquish a hireling army, Franklin, sobered by experience of dealing with the obstinate British leaders while he was in London, foresaw a long war. Summer soldiers and part-time militia could not win such a war, only a unified, disciplined force. Yet as commander-in-chief of forces besieging Boston, and this is a picture of him allegedly at Cambridge Commons, so it doesn't look much like it to me. I don't see Harvard off there in the background. Washington, facing this task of turning these people into a soldier, he realized that they had to be united into a single, as he called it, Continental Army. And to do so, that most of the men had only signed on through the end of 1775. Now, confronting an army of professional soldiers, Franklin and Washington knew that their army must be reconstituted as a permanent force. Now, as Congress came around to this view once the military commissions began expiring, with the British still embedded in Boston, it assigned Franklin to multiple committees charged with reforming the army. This work was what brought him to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to meet directly with Washington, and later to New Jersey and Washington to Philadelphia, where they met together and worked on these matters. But let's jump ahead, because we only have so much time, rather than talk about their very intricate minuet that they performed while Washington, during the rest of the war, where Washington led the army and Franklin was in Paris, sending over the aid we needed. We jump ahead to the Constitutional Convention. Now, before this convention even began, in the end of May in 1887, Franklin joined with Washington and Madison and a few others to draft what became known as the Virginia Plan for a unified federal government to replace the old Articles of Confederation, which was more a league of friendship than an actual government. with this central power having all those powers that Franklin and Washington had been badgering for, Franklin since the French and Indian War and Washington since the Revolutionary War, that is the powers over war and peace, over interstate and international commerce, over the power to tax and spend for the general welfare. And then they worked together on the key compromises that made it happen. Not compromises on those points, but compromises on executing details, as it were. Franklin referred to the entire episode, that 5-month-long work, as a vast interdimensional chess game. In addition to countless lesser additions and alterations, turning the Virginia Plan into a framed constitution required 3 major compromises or innovations, each of which engaged the full force of both Franklin and Washington, who by their very nature were master compromisers. They were principled in the sense that they would never compromise on their ends, but they were able, they both had served in the legislature, they were able at compromising over means to secure those ends. Foremost among these is the so-called Great Compromise, restructuring Congress to have proportional representation in the House of Representatives that would be popularly elected, and the Senate with equal representation from every state, which was akin to the old Articles of Confederation Congress, but with its state-appointed members serving fixed terms rather than floating ones. Although Franklin personally favored a popularly elected unicameral legislature, and Washington preferred that both houses reflect proportional representation as opposed to having either have equal representation, Franklin foresaw the final compromise from the outset and helped to broker it. Indeed, while led by Washington's Virginia and Franklin's Pennsylvania, which along with Massachusetts were the 3 most populous states, a majority of delegations supported proportional representation for both houses of Congress. A determined minority, mostly made up of small states like Delaware, demanded equal state representation and threatened to scuttle any deal without it. A fight over principle with practical implications, the contest for representation was not finally resolved for 2 months. Taking the measure of both sides in his folksy way, Benjamin Franklin, shown here in a painting that is in the US Capitol, what he'd do is he lived only 2 blocks from the Independence Hall, then called the State House, of course. And he would have meetings under his mulberry tree at his house. And this is this is on the wall of the Capitol building, showing him meeting with 3 other key delegates here, where he brokered a lot of these deals. He said about this compromise on the representation. Remember, the small states wanted equal representation, as in the Articles of Confederation. The big states wanted proportional representation in Congress. He said, well, if proportional representation takes place, the small states contend that their liberty will be in danger. If an equal votes is put in its place, the large states say their money will be in danger. Noting that we are meant to do something, Franklin urged that the convention act like a carpenter, who, when framing a table from 2 planks of uneven parts, takes a little from both and makes a good joint. The result was our current House and Senate. Well, as the delegates pushed on, debates on the presidency consumed more time at the convention than any other topic and were not resolved until the end. Having agreed to begin by working through the Virginia Plan, the delegates reached its resolution regarding reached the first discussion of its article in the Virginia Plan of the executive on June 1, so really only 4 days after the whole convention had begun. These called for a national executive chosen by Congress. Sounds a lot like a prime minister would be. Or most democracies today, England, Japan, you name it, Germany, the chief executive is picked by the legislature, and that's what the Virginia Plan called for. And this executive, according to the Virginia Plan, besides the general authority to execute the national laws, that this executive ought to enjoy all the executive rights vested in Congress by the Confederation. Well, what does this mean? We still don't know. That's been the problem of our presidency, and we've witnessed it in recent years. Just how powerful is our presidency? It's unclear. If these executive rights included all those once held by the British monarch and later vested in Congress, the provisions gave vast powers to the president. Beyond executing laws, the king in England, back then, held direct authority over war and peace, the military, foreign affairs, appointing officers and judges, granting pardons. He could create any treaty he wanted and cancel it at will. Since the Articles of Confederation vested power over these matters to Congress, they might go under the executive under the Virginia Plan. Then again, they might not. The resolutions were frustratingly vague on this score, as is our later Constitution. Perhaps because Washington, there he has a picture drawn during the Constitutional Convention on the spot. Perhaps because Washington, the presumed first president, was sitting among them, the delegates reached those resolutions. They just all got quiet. After brief comments by two supporting a strong executive, a considerable pause ensued, and then the chair asked if the delegates were ready to vote. Coming from Washington's delegation, no one seemed inclined to dispute them. Fully Washington's equal, though, and never one to defer, Franklin broke the silence, and there is him drawn at the convention, emphasizing that the structure of the executives is of great importance. He urged delegates, quote, to deliver their sentiments on it before the question was put. This comment burst the dam and debate flooded the room. 4 days later, the discussion still raging, Franklin said with reference to Washington and the presidency, the first man put at the helm would be a good one, but nobody knows what sort might follow him. The executive, this is Franklin speaking at the Constitutional Convention, the executive will always be increasing here, as elsewhere, until it ends in tyranny. Favoring a weak executive, at one point or another during the debates, Franklin advocated circumscribing the presidency with term limits and an advisory council by having a limiting veto power and by adding a provision for impeachment and removal from office. Impeachment's only there because Franklin asked for it. That was one of the few things he got. Now, Washington, for his part, consistently supported a strong executive and carried most of the states with him, who just willingly followed Washington. A third compromise involved slavery, which split Franklin and Washington. And I'll save that for a moment and come back to it. Let me now just finish here on the Constitution. When the convention ended on the last regular day of the convention, surveying the final product evolved from the Virginia Plan, Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph and Washington's own neighbor, George Mason, warned delegates, and here is Randolph, warned delegates that such a constitution with its vaguely defined but clearly engrossed presidency, quote, would either end in monarchy or a tyrannical aristocracy. And he, even though he had offered the Virginia Plan originally, he voted against it, as did Mason. Franklin had expressed similar concern, and here's Mason. Franklin had expressed similar concerns throughout the proceedings about the power of the presidency, but in part due to his trust in Washington as the first president. and in part because he believed that a stronger federal union was absolutely essential for the survival of the independent states. That is, that the alternative was worse than doing nothing. He accepted the final draft. He broke with the others. His lingering worries, however, may account for his widely quoted answer to the grand dame of Philadelphia high society, Elizabeth Powell, when she asked him after the convention ended if it had created a republic or a monarchy. Franklin famously replied, "A republican, madam, if you can keep it." Riddled with compromises, at the core, this was Washington's Constitution, especially with respect to the presidency. After the convention approved it, he declared, in the aggregate, it is the best constitution that can be obtained in this epoch. In particular, Washington defended the vast powers given to the president. Now, Franklin shared anti-federalist concerns over the power of the presidency and wanted a more democratic government, but endorsed the final draft's constitution as better than nothing and perhaps best of all. With a nod toward Washington on that final day before the entire assembled convention, Washington expressed his faith that the Constitution, quote, is likely to be administered well for a course of years, yet predicted that, and I'm quoting Franklin, that it will end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need a despotic government. That is, it's only the virtue of the people, not our leaders, that are going to keep us from being under despotism. That was Franklin's warning. Well, let me go back. I skipped that one compromise, and I see I don't want to go too long. I want to have time for your questions. So let me jump back to that compromise over slavery that I skipped over here, but deal with extensively in my book. Slavery was one matter that unbridgedly divided Franklin and Washington, just as it became the subject that 70 years later tore apart the states that they had worked so hard to knit together. Coming from the South and knowing full well the issue's divisiveness, temporizing on slavery was nothing new for Washington. It was his practice. Born into a slaveholding family, Washington owned over 100 slaves and controlled nearly 200 more in his wife's dower estate. During and after the Revolution, critics of slavery, from Quaker abolitionists to his much beloved military aide Lafayette, shown here at Mount Vernon, pleaded with Washington to denounce the institution publicly, or at least to set an example by freeing his own slaves. While he sometimes vocally sympathized with these views in private conversations with people like Lafayette, he always equivocated. Meanwhile, the number of his own slaves increased, and he never freed any of them during his lifetime. Indeed, he vigorously pursued those that ran away. Those in human bondage never knew who knew his private face, never saw Washington as a liberator. Not so Franklin, however. Since taking the reins of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in the mid-1780s during his term as the state's governor, Franklin had assumed an ever more prominent international position, criticizing the slave trade and urging abolition. He pleaded with influential slave owners such as Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph and Governor John Langdon of your neighboring state of New Hampshire to stop his state's merchant shippers from participating in the slave trade. Franklin hosted both men at his home during the convention and felt free to press them on the issue. His strategy, as he privately expressed it, was to bring the southern states into a fortified federal union and then have that government work to achieve abolition. Once the Constitution passed, he did not wait long. His final assault on slavery took the form of a petition to Congress in 1790 that he signed as president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, declaring that, quote, the equal liberty was originally the portion and is still the birthright of all men. It called on members to Congress to step to the very verge of the powers vested in you for discouraging every species of traffic in the persons of our fellow men. Paraphrasing the Constitution, he said that they had the powers included promoting the welfare and securing the blessings of liberty to the people of the United States. The petition asserted these blessings are rightfully to be administered without distinction of color to all descriptions of people. He supported his petition in the press with a slashing satire of slaveholders' defense of the institution. This drew on his newspaper background. He was a master newspaper writer, of course, and his history of assuming fictional guises like those of Silenced Dog Do-Good, which he did when he wrote for a Massachusetts newspaper, and Richard Saunders later in Philadelphia when he wrote Poor Richard's Almanac to make his points. Here, writing under the pseudonym of an Algerian divine that everyone really knew was Franklin. In words mocking Georgia Congressman James Jackson, who gave a speech to Congress, and here is Jackson. The Frank submitted, Franklin had this Muhammad Ibrahim, that was the name he took, ask regarding white Europeans then enslaved in North Africa in the Barbary states, quote, what is so pitiable in their present condition? Is their condition made worse by falling into our hands? No, for they are brought into a land where the sun of Islamism gives forth its full light and shines in splendor, and they had the opportunity of making themselves acquainted with the true doctrine and thereby saving their immortal souls. Well, modern satire relies on cultural relativism. And here Franklin was at his best. And I'm quoting a little more from his article. While serving us, he's now talking as Muhammad Abraham, while serving us, that is the European Christian slaves, we take care to provide them of everything. Their labors in our countries are, as I am informed, the laborers in their own countries are, as I am informed, worse fed, lodged, and clothed. The speech concluded by affirming that the Quran condones slavery in a passage that Franklin drew directly from biblical verse Ephesians 6:5, cited by Jackson to Congress, slaves, serve your masters with cheerfulness. Well, no reader could mistake Franklin's meaning. Washington was fuming mad, privately denouncing Franklin's intervention as, well, he put it kindly, untimely. Now, Washington, in contrast, his only divisive action against slavery came in freeing his own slaves by his will, delaying until death by revealing his intention to free his slaves, and then postponing their release until his widow would die, drained the act of its potential political and social significance. Trusted aides like Lafayette and prominent abolitionists like Virginia Quaker Robert Pleasants had urged Washington to act earlier. Ideally, during the idealistic fervor of the American Revolution, when Massachusetts had ended slavery, and so did Pennsylvania, and when they said if Washington acted then along with Franklin, as the two most trusted people in America, it might have made a difference. We don't know if it would have. But once dead, Washington could neither explain his motives nor present his final act as a model for his other slaveholders, especially when his wife Martha totally repudiated it. Even his wife, who owned most of the slaves at Mount Vernon as her dower property, didn't follow his lead. And this is hard to believe, but kept the mixed race children allegedly sired by her father. Those were her own half sisters, and by her son, who were her own grandchildren. She kept them enslaved. Southern slaveholders easily dismissed Washington's Deathbed Act, and Northern abolitionists struggled to give it meaning. Indeed, the Great Seal of the Confederacy would later have Washington at its center. Now, no one can know what might have happened had these two icons of the Revolution, Franklin and Washington, stood together against slavery at the nation's founding. Certainly some of their contemporaries thought it could make a difference. As it happened, they split over the issue, and with them, the nation. Washington and the southern states retained their slaves. Franklin and the northern states rejected the institution. Pleasants, remember the Virginia Quaker, Pleasants closed his 1874 letter to Washington with a warning. And he had been president of the Constitution of the Virginia Abolition Society. Notwithstanding, thou art now receiving the tribute of praise from a grateful people. The time is coming when all actions will be weighed in the balance and undergoing an impartial examination. How inconsistent will it appear to posterity should it be recorded that the great General Washington would keep a number of people in absolute slavery who were by their nature equally entitled to freedom as himself? Well, actually, the same test applies to all the founders. Despite their flaws, Franklin and Washington have held up better than most leaders of any age. Theirs was the founding partnership that launched a nation. Over the years, the harshest critics of Franklin have focused on his promotion of stultifying middle-class virtues. No man is glorious who is not laborious, he wrote in an archetypical Poor Richard's Almanac aphorism for 1734, adding a year later the ever-famous one, early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Generations of Americans took Franklin's maxim to heart and credited them as their way to wealth. Just as surely, generations of intellectuals from Edgar Allan Poe to F. Scott Fitzgerald mocked Franklin as a pedestrian prophet of pragmatism. Yet Franklin was a man of many faces, who, as an author hid behind masks, ranging from his first, the witty widow, Silence Newgood, to his last, the Arab slaver, Muhammad Abraham. Judging Franklin solely in his poor Richard Saunders guise failed to do him justice. Washington did not wear multiple masks, but so carefully cultivated the firm face of Republican virtue that he once famously cautioned a portraitist who was painting him, the great Gilbert Stuart, quote, "My countenance never yet betrayed my feelings." This aspect of Washington's personality can make him as difficult to see behind his public image as it is to look behind Franklin's multiple guises. Then as now, the Pennsylvania printer and the Virginia planner appeared too dissimilar to maintain a lasting friendship, especially since the former posed as a man of the people, a Midland man, as he liked to call himself, while the later preened as one above them. Indeed, referring to him once, his Massachusetts vice president said of Washington, "Oh, in Virginia, all ducks are swans." Yet focusing on their distinct public images obscures their fundamental similarities. Hardworking and entrepreneurial, Franklin and Washington had successful business careers outside of government and never viewed themselves as primarily politicians. Both prospered as colonists and supported royal rule until realizing that Britain would not extend basic English rights to Americans. Jealous of their liberties, they turned against the crown and never looked back. Each nurtured deep, lifelong relationships with both men and women. Natural leaders, people trusted them and they trusted others. Both men listened more than they talked, compromised on means to secure ends, relied on others, sacrificed of themselves and their own wealth for the common good, and never wavered on fundamental principles. And both were reformers, Franklin compulsory so. They saw problems and tried to fix them. Franklin's fixes ranged from mechanical to moral, lightning rods and bifocals to constitutions and popular philosophy. Washington's included constitutions, of course, but also agricultural reforms. Shaped by the Enlightenment, Franklin and Washington shared a Republican ideology and a progressivist faith that relied on human reason and divine providence rather than traditional ways and established dogmas. They sought truth and accepted facts. Life could get better, they believed. Theirs did. As the old order collapsed around them, they crafted a better one to replace it, one that has lasted for over 2 centuries. They did not see it as perfect and never thought it would last forever. If the people allowed it, Franklin warned, even the Constitution, for all its virtues, would lead to tyranny and the presidency serving as, to use his phrase, the fetus of a king. The example of Franklin and Washington, however, shows what individuals can do in times of faction, fracture, and failure to address problems and improve the state of affairs. Franklin was more than a Philadelphia printer, Washington much more than a Tidewater planter. They were larger-than-life American originals whose partnership in the revolutionary times laid the foundations for the world's first continental republic, which has lasted for nearly 250 years. Each recognized the other's goodness and greatness and viewed one another as partners in the fight for liberty. Others saw this too. Despite their critics, Franklin was elected to his state's highest office unanimously twice, and Washington was elected to his nation's highest office unanimously twice. Central to their Republican conceptions of service, both men willingly relinquished their public stations to return to their private positions. Indeed, both preferred private life to public power. Yet they were and are the two indispensable Americans, Franklin and Washington, the founding partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Larson. That was great. Remember, if you got a question, type it into the chat feature. You mentioned that they were friendly but not friends. Is that a fair thing to say?
No, they call themselves friends. They both referred themselves each other as friends, really all the way back to 1756 when they first met. So for a long period of time, but they wouldn't be what you'd call, they trusted each other. They were confident as well. They were confiding in each other. But no, you wouldn't, it wasn't like Washington and Hamilton, say.
Did Washington ever consider Franklin to be one of his cabinet members? I mean,
Franklin was too old.
Okay.
Franklin at the time was 82 when back then 82 was, today's 95 or something. So he didn't. indeed, Franklin would have been a competitor for president if he'd been younger. In contrast, Franklin was Washington's biggest booster to become president.
You talk of an episode, I thought it was really telling. You spend in your book, you certainly mention about how slavery is the great divide between the two, that they were just philosophically opposed on this one. And you mentioned an incident that I thought was quite telling, where Washington's calling on Franklin in Philadelphia, and he chooses to walk instead of riding a horse, because by riding a horse it meant he would have had to take a slave.
No, it wouldn't be riding a horse. He had this elaborate carriage. He wouldn't have rid a horse. He would have gone in his carriage from Robert Morris's house. The first thing he did when he came to the Constitutional Convention was drop off his luggage at Robert Morris's house where he was going to stay. And then immediately, before even unloading or unpacking beyond that, went to visit Franklin, who was the governor, or technically the title was president. But rather than ride in his carriage with the footman, which involves enslaved liveried footmen, it was close, and he liked to walk. He walked because the slaves he knew would offend Franklin. Franklin at the time was head of the America's first abolitionist society. Both of them were always sensitive to the feelings of others.
And both were cognizant of how things appeared in public as well. They're certainly conscious of their public images.
Very much so. Both of them cultivated a public image. Franklin as a man of the people, and Washington as a Virginia gentry.
Question here: since both are Freemasons, how did that influence their relationship? Because back then, tremendously. Not only were they both Freemasons, they were both head of the Masons in their state. They were 33-degree Masons. They were in the elite of Masonry. They were early Masons. They were in their founding chapters of their respective states. They joined it. They were both that sort of person. They were both joiners. They were both, and so whenever they'd be together, there would be that Masonic bond, and that certainly affected their very first meeting, why they clicked, as it were. During the French and Indian War, Franklin was the highest rank you could have in a state militia. Colonial militia was a colonel. You're in charge. He was head of the Pennsylvania militia. George Washington, much younger, was head, because his brother had died, head of the Virginia militia. The battle, as I showed in the chart, the French and Indian War, was fought over what's now Western Pennsylvania. And so that was territory claimed by both Virginia and Massachusetts, and that's why they worked so closely together. But their encounter was immediately shaped by the fact that they were the leading Masons in their respective states. So that gave them a bond and a tie from the day one. Now, beyond that, it's tough to figure it out, because back then, being a Mason was very much, as it is today, but more so then, a secret society. So but we do know that their shared Masonic ties were absolutely critical. And you think of that throughout the founders, many of them, like Richard Henry Lee, many of them were Masons, and that was a tie more than that. But Washington and Franklin were like not just Masons. And that made a huge difference for Franklin, by the way, when he went to France or when he went to England, because the Masonic movement was very strong in both Paris and London. And that gave him, because he was the head of the Pennsylvania Masons, that gave him a very high status. You mentioned they were confidants, that they would, if you were a fly on the wall, if just the two of them were together, who would defer to the other, one, and two, what would they confide in? What would Washington pick Franklin's brain on? What would Franklin pick Washington's brain on?
I don't think either was over the other unless they were talking about a narrow matters of the other's superior expertise. Like if Franklin was head of the War Committee meeting with Washington, he'd defer basically. He would give his advice, but he'd refer to Washington on military strategy. And if they were talking about structure of government, Washington would refer to Franklin. But they were really equals in that respect. And what they would confide about, I think they confided about how to handle slavery at the Constitutional Convention. They certainly confided on both all the other compromises. They confided on the Great Compromise, because that was offered by, even though neither of them wanted it, they clearly worked together. Franklin pushed it in committee, and Washington sealed the deal at private meetings. They had meetings together, but in their letters, a lot of those were private. In their letters back and forth, they confided about how to get the French Navy and Army where they needed to be, like most famously Yorktown during the Revolution.
You also mentioned both of them really preferred private life to public life, although they spent so much time in public life. How did Franklin do as a campaigner? I mean, did he have to campaign to become an elected official in Pennsylvania?
Sure. Both of them had to campaign. Washington was a famous campaigner. To become a member of the House of Delegates, he used to host. He used to bring the better liquor to the vote. They used to vote in public back then, and he'd bring the liquor to buy votes. But no, they both campaigned hard. In fact, they both lost elections to the legislature, and they won more than they lost, but they both lost in colonial times at times. Franklin would campaign in ads in newspapers. He would campaign door to door. Washington would, Washington would hold meetings, and they both were very public about it, and they both had issues and policies that were well known that would rise and fall. Franklin was a big promoter of public spending. He wanted, street lights. He got street lights to Philadelphia. He got the roads paved. He got sidewalks. He got all sorts of things like this. He was the consummate reformer. Washington had other issues that he would push. Washington got himself elected amazingly to the First Continental Congress. Everybody from Virginia and Massachusetts were the two big revolutionary states. Franklin was still over in Philadelphia, in London at the time for the First Continental Congress, and Washington got himself elected from Virginia, which was quite a feat, given that people who were hierarchically superior to them, members of more important families. The Washington family was not an FFV, unlike the Lees, say. But Washington, through his capabilities, got elected to the First Continental Congress. And Franklin sailed back and arrived just in time for the Second Continental Congress, and was immediately elected as a delegate from Pennsylvania. He'd already been a governor once. So yeah, they both, but they didn't like it. One of my favorite lines is in the Constitutional Convention. Franklin he always had his light wit, and he said he was trying to push term limits, and he said, well, why should people mind leaving the presidency or leaving being a senator to be a private citizen? That should be in America, in a republic, the government, the the elected officials serve the people, and therefore moving from being elected official to being one of the people is a promotion.
This kind of combines a couple of questions here. It's like, how did you research this, and did they correspond regularly with one another? Did that correspondence still survive?
Yeah, nobody would throw away a letter from either Washington or Franklin. They were the two most famous people, the two most famous Americans in the world. Yeah, their correspondence, so far as we know, there are a couple items that you can tell are missing, but there's a lot of it that survives. And there's a fair bit during the French and Indian War. There's an enormous amount during the Revolution, and then a consistent amount after the Revolution through till Franklin's death. And it's published now in both papers of Franklin, which are not quite finished, but they're generally accessible, and they're published in the papers of the letters of Washington. Both are being, volume by volume, are gradually being published, but you can access them either at Mount Vernon or through other sources.
What's your next project? What are you working on now?
Oh, I'm working on some more things dealing with the Revolution. I'm trying to flesh out some of the issues I raised here. So just plodding away. The COVID is a wonderful time for getting things done.
Yeah, you mentioned at the top of this that if you ever got into teaching during COVID, you would have got out of teaching, or words to that effect. But how are you managing being a professor during this? How's that working out?
I'm doing what I can. I'm trying to adjust my classes so they work online, but it's just not the same. It's not the same for the faculty or the students, but we try our best. One day at a time. Hopefully this will end by next fall and we'll be back to normal. Also, I've used up some of my, I tend to teach overload, so I've used up a bit of my courses just so I don't have to do this too much.
Well, I know I owe you a lobster dinner when you come to Falmouth, because you said you wanted to visit the Cape. So I'm looking forward to that happening. So one of these days when we got vaccine and we're all allowed to travel and and can have gatherings of more than 10 people, you got a date. Although I still wish I was at Pepperdine and so. Well, thank you very much for doing this. I greatly appreciate this. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope you appreciated this. It's great having a Pulitzer Prize winner, and stay safe, everybody. Again, Dr. Larson, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, and enjoy the wonderful winter on the Cape. It's a special experience.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.